Hello, hello Internet. Flip for the win here. I haven't done this in a while, but quickly doing another map musing. Quickly, haha. For PL Redroad B1V4 by IGO. So I was asked to look over this map, but I want to start by doing the whole spiel thing again because it's been a while since I've done this. But essentially, the entire purpose of this video and the criticisms or any comments I give, it's not really made from a perspective of this is the right way to do things. It's really just from a perspective of trying to inspire change. The way I say it is also I try to make a case for a lot of the suggestions, my viewpoints and thoughts, and to the map maker or anyone else listening, if they aren't convincing thoughts, I really don't think it's worth executing on them. So don't execute on something because I say this seems like a good idea. If you're convinced, then I think be inspired to make that change or do it in your own perspective. But I would say overall with this map, my 30 word summary would probably be something along the lines of it lacks a story for the narrative flow for the points. And I'll elaborate that as I get more into the points. But for the most part, I think we should just jump into it. Otherwise, I will never be able to leave the spawn room. Okay, first things first, I don't really like the direction you spawn. I assume this is because you have an intermediate area where there's going to be like, people can run around and do nonsense. But it's really weird to me to have a back spawn room that leads into another spawn room. Unless you're doing it for a reason. If you're doing it to break sight lines, that would be like Barn Blitz, but keep in mind the rotation isn't that long. And another thing, it doesn't really follow what I like to think of as pub flow, where you really just want to hold W out of your spawn room. This 90-degree angle with all this dead space is very weird. If you're leaving it for decorating, that's fine, but I don't really see why you wouldn't have them spawn in the open space unless it was A, sight lines, or B, something you actually want to deliberately input into the rotation time. Upward has a good example of this, where upward first, you spawn in the back of the room, and then once you cap the first point, you spawn forward, which is a little way of using the space as part of the rollout time, which is another really important aspect. So if I remember correctly, when during my testing, you have kind of like a standard rollout time. I want to say it's like 8 seconds for attackers, 16 for defenders, which is not uncommon. But this is also part of trying to do that micro balance is that I'd say you have to consider. Personally, I would just have the one spawn room. I also think it's kind of weird to have a resupply cabinet in the back spawn room and the forward spawn room. If you can think of Barn Blitz, they're only really located in one. Same for Upward. They're all in the forward space, I believe. But yeah, in terms of these actual doors, you can immediately tell from the middle main door, you have a very awkward sightline blocker. I assume this is because of the scale of your door to prevent the sniper sightline, but I do think it feels very awkward, essentially because obviously it doesn't cover some of the other angles. I think you can still get sniped, basically peeking over and under this, and it's very awkward for an attacker to snipe, actually, down this slope. I think there is already a map that fixes this. Borneo has kind of like a different approach where they have two little side paths into the big main door. Personally, I just make the main door smaller and give another access route, especially to rotate out. I do think it's also slightly awkward where you can't cross to the left without crossing the sight line, even though I might not expect a player to be there. You can see there's some small spots where you can get sniped from. The big thing about the attacking spawn is I think you need a rotation route where if I'm a medic, say I'm a medic, I have full Uber, I want to be able to peek out of one of my routes into a flank or into an alleyway that isn't super exposed to the enemy team, that isn't in some massive sniper sight line that pretty much no one can do anything about. A good example of this would probably be Upward. If you hug the left, then obviously you can't get sniped. Borneo, if you also hug the left, you think of as an attacker team, there's no direct sniper sight line that isn't being incredibly over-aggressive. If I look here on the right as well, even though this looks like it should be a protected rotation route out, you can see that massive sniper sight line, including this kind of like blind drop into the pit, isn't the greatest feeling. So I personally would probably move one of the rotation routes to encourage that aspect of I have a safe exit. I think the left and right exits, both on Borneo. Like the main route should be vulnerable to a sniper, but your other direction should have some element of mitigation or for you to be really cognizant of where you can really be attacked from. So yeah, I would actually move this over to the right, and I think mainly against this wall, you can see those angles are things where I expect to have the control of that because it's right outside of the spawn door. The room is the room. At least you can see it's not a doorway rather than a full range. That's just me ranting a little bit about the spawns. Moving onwards, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the routes, and then I'll talk a little bit about the narrative. So I like 2.5 choke design. It's kind of like my secret indulgent pleasure. I would say the current design boils into it. Like I would say technically is 2.5, but it gets very messy around this. So the point itself echoes, I would say, Borneo, where you have a left approach route, a bridge leading to a right route, and then narratively, I would say it also kind of echoes Borneo, where I expect 2 locations for the red primary hold, which would be behind this rock, where we've also put the ammo pack, or not rock, fence, we've put an ammo pack. I expect a red hold there, right? So engineers to kind of like gather around there, around this corner, and also around this corner. So very similar to Borneo, where you have the close side, close to the point, hold, and then an opposite side, where once the attacking team manages to push to the flank, they own the long sight line, they use that to break a lot of the buildings and build space here. But that narrative is really broken by a couple of things. First, there's another route that isn't even talked about or mentioned, this entire underground space, which I'm going to reserve commenting on real quick. And then the other big breaker of that hold is this doorway on the right, where I say this is the inner circle of the map, and that is a concept that's going to become really important talking about later points of the map. But the inner circle of the map is always the route that the attackers can take to cut off defenders, where if we talk competitive, which I know it's probably not a competitive map, but in competitive, you would never hold your combo, so your strong, like, really resilient team, the core of your team, in a way that the defenders could cut you, the attackers could cut you off, and that's exactly what this route does. You can see any hold past the doorway that immediately attackers have access to will be vulnerable. So this doorway in particular makes that side of a hold very weak. And then you also have the other route underneath, which kind of pops up over there, that also makes this route very weak. So it messes with that narrative I was trying to say. So to talk about the narrative a little bit, I think as a map maker, the most important thing to have is an idea of how you want your point to play, okay? So exactly like what I said, defenders hold here, and then the question is, what is preventing those holds from being legitimate? What should be the way to break those holds? And that's the narrative structure you build in your mind. So for me, I would say the story of this point is defenders have a crossfire hold on both sides. Attackers try to push the flank, and they do that through the assistance of different routes and methods. Eventually, they dislodge the defenders from behind that fence, and then, using the extra angle, they can focus, win this corner, and then push forward in kind of like a single blob, both sides blobbed, to eventually cap the point, whether it's edge capping or actually having to clear the upward bunker of space or what, right? And that narrative structure, okay, now I have that in mind. What is preventing that from happening? I just explained those to you, right? And then also, what are the elements that need to be adjusted? Where for me, my immediate instinct, one second, would be I would actually close this door or make this a sealed open corner. So red can have a light hold here, which is what bleeds out from the door. Have this door probably come out across this bridge. So it encourages pressure into this left route. I would close most of the bottom area. I don't think it should be a route that leads behind. I think it should be a route that pops up, say, here, that helps enable blue to put more pressure on this hold. And then I think, because the hold isn't very strong, this dead end could be an assistant rotation route into this hold, where right now, if I'm a red player and I want to cross to reinforce that side, there's no way of me doing that without crossing the giant major main sight line. So that's what makes the hold weak. And then I think once you have an exposed corner, once you take the hold, this extra tunnel becomes an attacker route as well that helps put pressure on the other hold. So you have this kind of like two-phase hold rather than currently now, where I think you had a version where you sealed off the back. Obviously, that's just going to be a one choke with the flank, and the flank is very tight. So it's just a two choke, which is probably the problem with your second point. We're not quite there yet. So yeah, those are a few elements of a few of the thoughts I had and a few of the suggestions I might make. For the most part, I don't really have too many things that I wouldn't say are too nitpicky. Like you can splash through this glass. I assume you probably know that. This wall, I don't know if it's just in this version, is thin enough that you can throw stuff through it. And it looks like, my thought, again, the narrative, is that it looks like red is meant to have somewhat of a hold up here on the top, right? And my only issue is while they might rain players down, this is a very easy point to dry cap, where if you think of Borneo, I'm talking about that structure again, right? You can dislodge the players from the building before you cap. That is like a viable approach plan. But here, I feel like it's almost completely unnecessary because this is much easier to just like tap in because the geometry to hold the point from here, unless you're shooting straight down, which doesn't cover the point, the only place you can stand is on this very thin, awkward wall. I don't have the mobility to not get juggled off, and on this side I'm dead, and there's no rotation route up. On the other side, I'm in the pit, and I have to kind of like awkwardly walk up the stairs to continue trying to fight. I can't crouch jump up this, so there's no real way for me to fight those players. The biggest taboo I think you can do in a lot of TF2 geometry is to have people know there's enemies like on the other side of this door or on the other side of this wall and not have a good way to rotate or fight them. Also, the staircase being exposed to this doorway makes it incredibly vulnerable, where even trying to fight like this gets you destroyed by these long sight lines across, or even just players coming in through a lot of these blind flanks. So I don't know, it's a very awkward kind of like vision-based point. I personally, I thought this point would be pretty difficult to hold in the first place, which isn't bad for a first point, but I think currently it falls because there's too many routes, they're too organized, and it's missing that kind of narrative flow because I think this door, primarily, the way I like to think about it is if red manages to reasonably get out this door, I'm here, you have to immediately think, if I Uber out this door, is there anything red can do about it? And the answer is no until the point, which means red holding in any of this open space is pretty infeasible most of the time. I would say for 24 players, for 100 players it's a little bit more messy, but still, I think pretty much to deny this, you would need like a pyro denying it full time for you to not get wiped, pushed, and then whatever they wipe, they can just roll to the point on. So it's very awkward because I would say you have a staggered point here. If there is a hold out here, then it weakens the hold in there. So a little bit more certainty on the instinct for where you want players to build or kind of like stage, I think would help a lot at this point. But yeah, narratively, I don't think it's a bad idea to have like the sort of bunker. That seems to be something a lot of people like a lot, having the bunker that then gets busted to break through the point. But I feel like you might have this kind of like premature satisfaction where the point is capped even though you have a bunker up top if you don't handle it too well. Moving on to this next point, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, probably the respawn timers, right? So respawn timers make a huge deal in timer-centric game modes. I don't really consider payload a timer-centric game mode. I consider it an attack-defense game mode, where the attacks have a number of attacks based off the timer, but it's not really working with the same attack initiatives, because the attacking team always wants to attack. It's deliberated by the game mode, where in Koth, the defending team, they own the point, changes, right? So you only attack based off your position if you're playing like pseudo-seriously, right? So essentially, what I was trying to say with that is, in Koth, if you own the point, you are never incentivized to trade, right? Where in attack defend, you are almost always incentivized to trade based off the spawn timers. So if I trade with someone, we both kill each other, I'm up in 8 seconds, he's up in 16, I'm up for another 8 seconds, that's an advantage for my team, right? So normally, high lethality, combat spaces that are open, where a lot of people are dying, almost always favors the attackers. The exception to this is this area, not because of its geometry, but because of its distance to the spawns. So blue does not get a forward spawn here, that's important to note. So their rollout time, disregarding teleporters, right, is all the way back there. Remember, that back area, walking all the way forward, all the way around, up to this point. And I would wager that distance is about 8 seconds compared to, and when you compare that to, like I said, the difference in red respawn time and their rollout, which is literally just out this door and to the left, where they can immediately have access to not just the flank, but also the choke sightline, that basically has the teams on even grounds. So you've equalized the attacker's advantage in terms of spawn times. Now, in terms of geometry and routing, you can already see this is incredibly brutal. For, I think, obvious reasons. I just call it the surface area argument, which definitely applies to 100-player TF2, where essentially I like to think of how risky a doorway is, essentially revolves around how many how many defenders you have immediately with vision on that doorway. So if I peek out this doorway, there's no way for me to peek like only one group. I'm going to peek all the groups at once, and they're probably already spamming this doorway, so because 100 players. So the real ability to enable, I would say, doorways to be clear is that you can clear the doorway, so clear the attackers through the other side of the doorway and then push through it, right? That's not possible with any of these doors. Even if you clear the players, you never are able to push around the corner without aggroing everyone at once, including the players above you, which is very awkward, by the way. I don't like vertical combat in TF2. I think it ends up being some of the worst combat when you're fighting someone straight down or straight up. But you can see as a defending player, it's pretty easy to rotate and watch essentially all three of these routes from the same position. With no required movement, then you can just have an incredibly lazy, spammy defense. How you really pressure the defending team is by pressure cooking them in different areas, poking different places. But you can't really attack from different angles on this point because you can see three of routes blow into the same area. And the one other option you have is a very, very tight stuffable flank, where you can see not only is this flank door very stuffable, not only is it directly in front of a spawn, so this is the inner circle route, but it's immediately in the red rollout, so it will be watched always just by players rolling out, and the quickest to reinforce. So even if you push through, the window will close the fastest on this point. And it doesn't actually give you any immediate ground. Even if I manage to kill everyone there and I clear through the doorway, I am hit, like, blindsided by this very awkward 90-degree angle. I have to fight these players, and I have to fight the respawners. So it's a very brutal push, where it doesn't actually win you any important ground. Where I'll say my suggestion, on the other hand, it looks like you already had this in mind, where it should be a route across. That building, I always thought, should be for the purpose of dislodging defenders from this hold. So how do you get attackers to this building? Well, you have like a protected cross, or you have a cross that doesn't involve rotating quite far in to rotate around. Now, obviously, the big problem with this is you have made this go very, very, very deep. So if the attacking team ever gets access to this, then you can see they can go all the way back here in the tunnels. And then once they go all the way back in the tunnels, now they're bloody behind the red spawn. They can also be spawn camping, and this isn't good, because you want players to have a good idea of where combat direction is. You don't really want this like 180-degree spread of combat unless they deliberately kind of like put themselves between two options. So I personally would suggest you cut off that entire route and have it brought back into the combat, where I would separate out Red's ability to push in to this high ground and have this high ground be the thing blue uses to dislodge red players from the high ground. Once red players are dislodged from the high ground, you can see now they have to cross the blue sight line, so they're pushed back around the corner. And then now that they're pushed back around the corner, blue can come forward. And I don't really think they can use this ground up top behind me right now, like up here above me, where that's something I consider, how attackers could use this ground to also dislodge from the next area and point. But I do think it's also slightly ambitious, let's say, to have the point literally beneath the red spawn. I personally would probably move the spawn further back, but I do think the sightlines could be a slight concern if that was true. But yeah, that's a little bit of how to adjust it. And if you look at the elements, you look at the spawn times, and you look at the routes like that, I think it's reasonable to see why this point would definitely stalemate. There's pretty much no way for blue to aggress onto this high ground. So say there's like a heavy, that's a bad analogy, a sentry, just like up here, right? There is not really a way to peek that sentry in a way that makes sense. Yes, you could blind spam, but remember, it's someone's first time playing the map. They don't even know the sentry's there. Instead, if they go on the low ground, let's say there's a ton of people here. I'm Ubered. Okay, I'm Ubered. I see there's a sentry up there. The engineer picks it up. He goes in. How can I chase him? That's the key thing. Once I do damage, how can I chase up on kills? The attacking team here, the Uber rotation looks like this, which is very awkward, as you can see. That's a very long rotation. My Uber's basically out. Not to mention I have to wade through the defensive team. So you should always... In this case, I think it's a good idea to think about how can my Uber approach that big group and crowd of players, or does that big group of crowd of players have an easy retreat route? In this case, yes, which makes it hugely, hugely defensive favored. All right, moving on. I'm going to ignore a lot of the awkward side routes now. I think for the most part, this area, because this is one of the elements you have when you, like, obviously during the playtest I watch, people are just slayed, right? But if you have a very, very hard hold, you actually might misjudge the balance on your next point, because the point is only won with essentially a wipe. This is very common on public Badwater, right? Where Badwater's second point is held in pubs, and as a result, Badwater third is very rarely held, because the point is generally rolled through by the attacking team's momentum. In competitive, conversely, it's not really played much anymore. But in competitive, the second point is very softly held. Why? Keep in mind, inner circle. You would never keep your combo on the opposite circle. I can talk about rolling in momentum, that doesn't make sense. But essentially, second point on Badwater is weakly held. The third point is strongly held. So in competitive, they recognize the ability to give up a weak point for an even stronger point, or even a strong point for another stronger point. In pubs, that'll never happen. Pubs will always expect to hold every point, which is something that you have to also keep in mind and design around. What that would mean for a hard-held point is even if the next point is aggressively designed, it might roll. And in this case, during the playtest I saw, obviously players were slayed, so it basically counts as a full wipe, and this entire area was rolled through. I think the geometry in this back area is very unusual. The routing is just very, very long. It's a very lengthy rotation. Could always be the scale. It's very hard to judge scale when you're walking around a map by yourself. But I also think some of it is quite unintuitive, where I immediately see something like this. I think, okay, I want to get up there. How do I get up there? I would rotate through the low ground, and that access doesn't really work. Okay, well, I see the pipe. How do I get to the pipe? And you can see this door getting to that door there doesn't really make sense to me. And it's a very awkward rotation route that also the attackers use later on. So if I'm an attacker, right, and I'm walking through this area, and I think I want to get up to that door, my immediate instinct is this door, which does not lead up there. This is the only route up there, and considering this is a huge, important flank route door, in my opinion, or at least it's high ground, that's very awkward. Same for this space. As far as I know, there is no way for non-mobile classes to get up to this window from this side, which is very unusual, I'd say. I wouldn't really design it that way without this long rotation route. It doesn't really make sense for the attacking team to be going back and forth this much. Maybe a good way to look at it is, if there is high ground, there should be a somewhat obvious way to get up to the high ground. I see that high ground, I see a door, I think these two are linked, even if they're not. As an attacking player, to get that door, I think the only way, if I'm a ground-based class, is to go all the way around like this, go around like this, go up like this, go through the shutter, and then go over there, which is quite absurd, I think, and why your flank is probably criminally underutilized. Actually, wait, does this lead over? This is me. Okay, yeah, that also works, but you can see going backwards to go forwards is going to be very unintuitive and awkward, especially because I think that was a red arrow, now that I think about it somewhere. Yeah, I'm getting lost in the sauce a bit. But to talk about this next point, all of this area reasonably gets rolled. And now, this is the really interesting thing. Given that structure I basically told you about the flanks being quite well hidden, I'd say, this point actually boils down to, crucially, a one-choke, where red, I believe, spawns immediately here, right? And they drop literally on the point, which makes it quite absurd to me that this point rolled in the playtest. I can only hazard the guess it is because of the momentum and because of rolling, where one of the big aspects, especially if people are unfamiliar with a map, is they will go forward rather than holding a logical hold until they encounter conflict. And when you have a team deathballed and you have a team that is split between people wanting to defend on the point and people rolling out, generally the team that's split is going to get rolled by the deathball, which is what I experienced in the playtest. But I think in practice, this is quite a brutal hold simply because of the same proximity issue I mentioned, where blue has quite a long rollout from the second point, which obviously they don't have to do if they didn't die or didn't wipe, while red has quite a close spawn, close rotation, and very good sightlines, I'd say, where a lot of these sightlines are right-hand peeker angle favored, which means classes like Soldier can easily splash using corner peeking strategies. So it is just a little bit thing. It's one of the things I'd be cautious for. I estimate in a stalled situation, so let's say the team doesn't manage to immediately roll, that this point seems like it would be very brutal to push, primarily because of the flank rotations being so long and awkward. But moving on to the next point, trying to keep this in a timely fashion, the important note here is the exact same inner circle philosophy I think I mentioned before, where you have three routes. One of them I'd say is the inner circle close route here, one of them is the main route, one of them is the outside route. The outside route has the same issue where it's honestly maze-like, and then to actually get up there, it seems like the only rotation, I even did it wrong there, is to go from back there. So to get to that high ground, I believe the only route is to go from the windows all the way across, doing this jumping puzzle, coming back around over to this area. As a result, you are only going to have red players occupying this high ground space, because for them it's quite simple. They come out of spawn, they just hug this wall, they just keep going, and now they're all owning the high ground, right? So compared to the blue route to get this point, the red route is quite crazy. And then the blue route here, you can see my eyes are immediately drawn to try to go to the high ground. Where does the high ground lead? It leads to this very, very involved flank that leads all the way to red's spawn, right? And the big problem with this is, I always say, in 24-player TF2, I said this in Watercourse, when you're focusing on pub design, you're really going to have, I think, 80% of the players. So on 24 players, you might have 10 of the 12 players on your team focusing on just going the main route, going the route that draws their attention the most, just kind of like playing on instinct in terms of the routes they really want to like go to. And the trick for pub design is making sure those 10 players who are picking a random route that feels right to them without knowing the map are still useful to the 2 players who might already know the map or are trying to like structure a push or know which routes are important to take the next point. Obviously, for this room, the key to being able to push through this area is the high ground, right? So the 2 players who are more cognizant might say, okay, it's important we take that high ground. If 10 players are just spamming through main, as long as they can rotate to push the high ground, that's good. But unfortunately, you have 10 players not assisting that room push at all, going flanking all the way behind, where the cart, because it's not CP, it doesn't matter if you just get to the end, you need to actually push it through this space, will obviously get stuck here. And I think that's exactly what happened in the playtest I viewed, where blue had a very weak attack on this high ground because there is simply no rotation route up to the high ground that is logical or reasonable or easily discoverable. And obviously crossing these sightlines is, I would say, not a realistic option, just given you're crossing through players on high ground, you're crossing through major sightlines, and you're crossing through other major sightlines, right? So it's a very unappealing to play shooting gallery versus this many players, and then it's also very difficult to pull a combo that way as well. So obviously as a medic, you probably wouldn't want to cross all these sightlines with no ability to rotate or really to focus those players in a single direction on your screen to keep all your threats marginalized on one side. So that would be kind of like the narrative flow. For suggestions for this point, I think it's better to bring this into combat, to bring it kind of like a choke hourglass way, and then if you really want this outside kind of like past protection route, to do it past a certain choke point, to have like a blue staging area where blue pushes to a certain point. Think of the outside of Borneo. I don't know why I keep going to Borneo, but the outside of Borneo is something where blue can really massively push there. It's very difficult for the attacking team to push out into that space. If I look at the staging area for this point, it might be this slope, kind of, but they don't own the red high ground over there, so maybe before this? Like, there's not really a good appealing route that I think enables you to rotate to all your directions. Like if I'm an engineer, I put a blue teleporter here, I feed my team into the flank, which is unfortunate. I feed my team to the main, but there's no pressure on that other side. So for me, a good staging area needs to be easily defendable. It needs to have access to all routes so that if like the team can kind of like split evenly. And that's a little bit on the engineer not sabotaging things. But that's probably how I'd look at it. But yeah, I think enabling the outer rotation makes a lot more sense. Enabling the players to feed back into the main room makes a lot more sense. And then for defending players, having a certain cutoff point where this is now the kind of like room you live in, where it's very difficult to push out, also makes a lot of sense. I call it kind of like the last hold. So you can use Borneo as kind of like a reference. Overall, I would say the routing and structuring is quite confusing. I think areas like this are quite unusual because you can see a red player seeing that staircase and thinking, okay, this is kind of like my flank route to get behind, and then it ending in a doorway when they're attacking. So maybe one of the things I like to do is walk through the map as both an attacker and defender and identify the routes that you would naturally rotate to. So if I'm a defender, I manage to push the attacking team really far back. Is there anywhere evil I can get? In this case, I would say yes, right? Where if I push the defending team back here, you can see I would go this way, which an attacker might never go. Because why would the attacker go in the same route? And then assess if that's problematic based off the ground it then takes you. And like I said before, if I'm an attacker and I see a player on that high ground, how can I rotate to be in that position? Like exactly where that player is standing? Or how do I even get on this pipe and make that illustration clear? Honestly, I'm a big fan of like simple exposed routes rather than anything else. I think at the very least it would be nice to have simple routes, expose those simple routes, see how people use them. If they're too strong, then nerf them by making them convoluted or awkward later. Although I'm still not, I'm not really a big fan of the convoluted awkward routes. This area, I can't really see it ever getting play simply because, keep in mind, it's the outer circle. So the outer circle, unless it leads to something really significant, it's primarily used by flankers, not that big, like, big conglomerate. And it's going to be very difficult to feed players into a lot of these spaces, I would say, as well, just because the routing is so out of the way. But yeah, those are my quick rants and thoughts on the subject. I don't know if this is still the case, but it kind of looked like the defending team could enter this space and the attacking team couldn't, which was quite weird because the defending team entered through there, rotated through here, I think, and the attackers could never do anything about it. Like, they would be stuck outside seeing some of those players rotate, but it could just be an error. I'd look over the demo, because I imagine there's quite a few situations like that. But hopefully this insight helps. It's just really a kind of like a rambly, long-winded review. But, you know, 100-player TF2 is kind of like a big can of worms. So there's a lot of things that I am still pulling from 24-player design. Some of it applies, some of it probably doesn't. Hopefully some of this was useful in inspiring you to make a change. Feel free to reach out and ask me if you have any questions, thoughts, or if you want to have like a live discussion on this topic. All right. Bye.